Chapter 2. There was a second-floor corner room in less unkempt shape than the rest of the house, and into this my host led me, setting down his small lamp and lighting the somewhat larger one. From the cleanliness and contents of the room, and from the books ranged along the walls, I could see that I had not guessed amiss in thinking the man a gentleman of taste and breeding. He was a hermit and eccentric, no doubt, but he still had standards and intellectual interests. As he waved me to a seat, I began a conversation on general topics, and was pleased to find him not at all taciturn. If anything, he seemed glad of someone to talk to, and did not even attempt to swerve the discourse from personal topics. He was, I learned, one Antoine de Ricci of an ancient, powerful, and cultivated line of Louisiana planters. More than a century ago, his grandfather, a younger son, had migrated to southern Missouri and founded a new estate in the lavish, ancestral manner, building this pillared mansion and surrounding it with all the accessories of a great plantation. There had been at one time as many as 200 Negroes in the cabins which stood on the flat ground in the rear, ground that the river had now invaded, and to hear them singing and laughing and playing the banjo at night was to know the fullest charm of a civilization and social order now sadly extinct. In front of the house, where the great guardian oaks and willows stood, there had been a lawn like a broad green carpet, always watered and trimmed, and with flagstoned, flower-bordered walks curving through it. Riverside, for such the place was called, had been a lovely and idyllic homestead in its day, and my host could recall it when many traces of its best period still lingered. It was raining hard now, with dense sheets of water beating against the insecure roof, walls and windows, and sending in drops through 1,000 chinks and crevices. Moisture trickled down to the floor from unsuspected places, and the mounting wind rattled the rotting, loose-hinged shutters outside. But I minded none of this, nor even thought of my roadster outside beneath the trees, for I saw that a story was coming. Incited to reminiscence, my host made a move to show me to sleeping quarters, but kept on recalling the older, better days. Soon I saw I would receive an inkling of why he lived alone in that ancient place, and why his neighbors thought it full of undesirable influences. His voice was very musical as he spoke on, and his tale soon took a turn which left me no chance to grow drowsy. Yes, Riverside was built in 1816, and my father was born here in 1828. He'd be over a century old now if he were alive, but he died young, so young I can just barely remember him. In 64 that was, he was killed in the war, 7th Louisiana Infantry CSA, for he went back to the old home to enlist. My grandfather was too old to fight, yet he lived on to be 95 and helped my mother bring me up. A good bringing up too, I'll give them credit. We always had strong traditions, high notions of honor, and my grandfather saw to it that I grew up the way de Russis have grown up, generation after generation, ever since the Crusades. We weren't quite wiped out financially, but managed to get on very comfortably after the war. I went to a good school in Louisiana and later to Princeton. Later on, I was able to get the plantation on a fairly profitable basis, though you see what it's come to now. My mother died when I was 20 and my grandfather 2 years later. It was rather lonely after that. And in 85, I married a distant cousin in New Orleans. Things might have been different if she'd lived, but she died when my son Denny was born. Then I had only Denny. I didn't try marriage again, but gave all my time to the boy. He was like me, like all the de Russis, darkish and tall and thin, and with the devil of a temper. I gave him the same training my grandfather had given me, but he didn't need much training when it came to points of honor. It was in him, I reckon. Never saw such high spirit. All I could do to keep him from running away to the Spanish War when he was 11. Romantic young devil too, full of high notions. You'd call 'em Victorian now. No trouble at all to make him let the nigger wenches alone. I sent him to the same school I'd gone to, and to Princeton too. He was class of 1909. In the end, he decided to be a doctor and went a year to the Harvard Medical School. Then he hit on the idea of keeping to the old French tradition of the family and argued me into sending him across to the Sorbonne. I did, and proudly enough, though I knew how lonely I'd be with him so far off. Would to God I hadn't. I thought he was the safest kind of a boy to be in Paris. He had a room in the Rue Saint-Jacques, that's near the university in the Latin Quarter, but according to his letters and his friends, he didn't cut up with the gayer dogs at all. The people he knew were mostly young fellows from home, serious students and artists who thought more of their work than of striking attitudes and painting the town red. But of course there were lots of fellows who were on a sort of dividing line between serious studies and the devil. The aesthetes, the decadents, experimenters in life and sensation. The Baudelaire kind of a chap. Naturally, Denny ran up against a good many of these and saw a good deal of their life. They had all sorts of crazy circles and cults, imitation devil worship, fake black masses, and the like. Doubt if it did them much harm on the whole. Probably most of them forgot all about it in a year or two. One of the deepest in this queer stuff was a fellow Denis had known at school, for that matter whose father I'd known myself, Frank Marsh of New Orleans. Disciple of Lafcadio Hearn and Gauguin and Van Gogh, regular epitome of the yellow 90s, poor devil. He had the makings of a great artist at that. Marsh was the oldest friend Denny had in Paris, so as a matter of course they saw a good deal of each other, to talk over old times at St. Clair Academy and all that. The boy wrote me a good deal about him, and I didn't see any especial harm when he spoke of the group of mystics Marsh ran with. It seems there was some cult of prehistoric Egyptian and Carthaginian magic having a rage among the bohemian element on the left bank, some nonsensical thing that pretended to reach back to forgotten sources of hidden truth in lost African civilizations. The great Zimbabwe, the dead Atlantean cities in the Hoggar region of the Sahara, and that had a lot of gibberish connected with snakes and human hair. At least I called it gibberish then. Denny used to quote Marsh as saying odd things about the veiled facts behind the legend of Medusa's snaky locks and behind the later Ptolemaic myth of Berenice, who offered up her hair to save her husband-brother and had it set in the sky as the constellation Coma Berenices. I don't think this business made much impression on Denny until the night of the queer ritual at Marsh's rooms when he met the priestess. Most of the devotees of this cult were young fellows, but the head of it was a young woman who called herself Tanit Isis, letting it be known that her name in this latest incarnation, as she put it, was Marceline Bedard. She claimed to be the left-handed daughter of Marquis de Chameau, and seemed to have been both a petty artist and an artist's model before adopting this more lucrative magical game. Someone said she had lived for a time in the West Indies, Martinique, I think, but she was very reticent about herself. Part of her pose was a great show of austerity and holiness, but I don't think the more experienced students took that very seriously. Dennis, though, was far from experienced and wrote me fully 10 pages of slush about the goddess he had discovered. If I'd only realized his simplicity, I might have done something, but I never thought a puppy infatuation like that could mean much. I felt absurdly sure that Denny's touchy personal honor and family pride would always keep him out of the most serious complications. As time went on, though, his letters began to make me nervous. He mentioned this Marceline more and more, and his friends less and less, and began talking about the cruel and silly way they declined to introduce her to their mothers and sisters. He seems to have asked her no questions about herself, and I don't doubt but that she filled him full of romantic legendary concerning her origin and divine revelations and the way people slighted her. At length I could see that Denny was altogether cutting his own crowd and spending the bulk of his time with this alluring priestess. At her especial request, he never told the old crowd of their continual meetings, so nobody over there tried to break the affair up. I suppose she thought he was fabulously rich, for he had the air of a patrician, and people of a certain class think all aristocratic Americans are wealthy. In any case, she probably thought this a rare chance to contract a genuine right-handed alliance with a really eligible young man. By the time my nervousness burst into open advice, it was too late. The boy had lawfully married her and wrote that he was dropping his studies and bringing the woman home to Riverside. He said she had made a great sacrifice and resigned her leadership of the magical cult, and that henceforward she would be merely a private gentlewoman, the future mistress of Riverside and mother of de Russes to come. Well, sir, I took it the best way I could. I knew that sophisticated continentals have different standards from our old American ones. And anyway, I really knew nothing against the woman. A charlatan, perhaps, but why necessarily any worse? I suppose I tried to keep as naive as possible about such things in those days, for the boy's sake. Clearly, there was nothing for a man of sense to do but to let Denny alone, so long as his new wife conformed to de Russie ways. Let her have a chance to prove herself. Perhaps she wouldn't hurt the family as much as some might fear, so I didn't raise any objections or ask any penitence. The thing was done, and I stood ready to welcome the boy back, whatever he brought with him. They got here 3 weeks after the telegram telling of the marriage. Marceline was beautiful, there was no denying that, and I could see how the boy might very well get foolish about her. She did have an air of breeding, and I think to this day she must have had some strains of good blood in her. She was apparently not much over 20, of medium size, fairly slim, and as graceful as a tigress in posture and motions. Her complexion was a deep olive, like old ivory, and her eyes were large and very dark. She had small, classically regular features, though not quite clean-cut enough to suit my taste, and the most singular head of jet-black hair that I ever saw. I didn't wonder that she had dragged the subject of hair into her magical cult, for with that heavy profusion of it, the idea must have occurred to her naturally. Coiled up, it made her look like some oriental princess in a drawing of Aubrey Beardsley's. Hanging down her back, it came well below her knees and shone in the light as if it had possessed some separate, unholy vitality of its own. I would almost have thought of Medusa or Berenice myself, without having such things suggested to me, upon seeing and studying that hair. Sometimes I thought it moved slightly of itself, and tended to arrange itself in distinct ropes or strands, but this may have been sheer illusion. She brushed it incessantly, and seemed to use some sort of preparation on it. I got the notion once, a curious, whimsical notion, that it was a living thing which she had to feed in some strange way. All nonsense, but it added to my feeling of constraint about her and her hair. For I can't deny that I failed to like her wholly, no matter how hard I tried. I couldn't tell what the trouble was, but it was there. Something about her repelled me very subtly, and I could not help weaving morbid and macabre associations about everything connected with her. Her complexion called up thoughts of Babylon, Atlantis, Lemuria, and the terrible forgotten dominations of an elder world. Her eyes struck me sometimes as the eyes of some unholy forest creature or animal goddess, too immeasurably ancient to be fully human. And her hair, that dense, exotic, overnourished growth of oily inkiness, made one shiver as a great black python might have done. There was no doubt but that she realized my involuntary attitude, though I tried to hide it, and she tried to hide the fact that she noticed it. Yet the boy's infatuation lasted. He positively fawned on her, and overdid all the little gallantries of daily life to a sickening degree. She appeared to return the feeling, though I could see it took a conscious effort to make her duplicate his enthusiasms and extravagances. For one thing, I think she was piqued to learn that we weren't as wealthy as she had expected. It was a bad business all told. I could see that sad undercurrents were arising. Denny was half hypnotized with puppy love and began to grow away from me as he felt my shrinking from his wife. This kind of thing went on for months, and I saw that I was losing my only son, the boy who had formed the center of all my thoughts and acts for the past quarter century. I'll own that I felt bitter about it. What father wouldn't? And yet, I could do nothing. Marceline seemed to be a good wife enough in those early months, and our friends received her without any quibbling or questioning. I was always nervous, though, about what some of the young fellows in Paris might write home to their relatives after the news of the marriage spread around. Despite the woman's love of secrecy, it couldn't remain hidden forever. Indeed, Denny had written a few of his closest friends in strict confidence as soon as he was settled with her at Riverside. I got to staying alone in my room more and more, with my failing health as an excuse. It was about that time that my present spinal neuritis began to develop, which made the excuse a pretty good one. Denny didn't seem to notice the trouble or take any interest in me and my habits and affairs. And it hurt me to see how callous he was getting. I began to get sleepless and often racked my brain in the night to try to find out what really was the matter, what it really was that made my new daughter-in-law so repulsive and even dimly horrible to me. It surely wasn't her old mystical nonsense, for she had left all the past behind her and never mentioned it once. She didn't even do any painting, although I understood that she had once dabbled in art. Oddly, the only ones who seemed to share my uneasiness were the servants. The darkies around the house seemed very sullen in their attitude toward her, and in a few weeks all save the few who were strongly attached to our family had left. These few, old Scipio and his wife Sarah, the cook Delilah, and Mary, Scipio's daughter, were as civil as possible, but plainly revealed that their new mistress commanded their duty rather than their affection. They stayed in their own remote part of the house as much as possible. McCabe, our white chauffeur, was insolently admiring rather than hostile, and another exception was a very old Zulu woman said to have come from Africa over 100 years before, who had been a sort of leader in her small cabin as a kind of family pensioner. Old Sophonisba always showed reverence whenever Marceline came near her, and one time I saw her kiss the ground where her mistress had walked. Blacks are superstitious animals, and I wondered whether Marceline had been talking any of her mystical nonsense to our hands in order to overcome their evident dislike.